So today I want to talk about a feature that was released back in Cisco Secure Workload 3.6, and it's around process-based segmentation on the Windows-based workloads. And right now, the feature itself doesn't translate to Linux because we use IP tables on that side, and they don't have the capability to segment based on user or services within IP tables with IP sets. But Windows, using Windows Filtering Platform or Windows Advanced Firewall, does have that capability. So one of the use cases for this that comes up a lot with customers during calls, because we provide workload protection, is, well, how does that deal with dynamic port ranges? You know, if you're enforcing a firewall policy at the workload and you have something like passive FTP, how does the solution actually encompass those ephemeral ports that passive FTP uses? So what we've done, at least for the purposes of this presentation, is came up with a scenario where we have a client and an FTP server. And what typically happens with regards to FTP is that we will have something from the FTP client that will be going out to the FTP server on control port 21. And typically, if we're using something like active FTP, it would just, the data traffic would be sent over port 20. But in the case of passive FTP, what happens is the client is actually, after the control session is established, comes back and says, hey, instead of using the port command, we're going to use the passive command, and you're going to return to me another port to instantiate a TCP connection to. So once that passive connection is set, it's actually going to reply back with this port, and then any data traffic is going to be sent to this new, usually a high-level port, like a 65XXX. So this process for workload protection causes some issues, right, traditionally, because what we're doing is we're securing at the endpoint based on an IP address or a port protocol, some sort of tuple. But how can we predict what port, right? If it's using something passively and it's just randomly selecting a port saying, instantiate your data connection on this port, how can we accurately guess that? Well, one method, right, and it's pretty tried and true, we see this a lot with Active Directory and like dynamic RPC ports, is sometimes we can come into the FTP server and we can kind of have a range set up. So we could come in and we could say something like, only use port 40,000 through 40,005. We shouldn't really have that many FTP clients. And then we can write a policy around that. And that's, right now, if we were working with Linux, that's something that we might have to do, is come in and set some parameters. But because of our new process-based segmentation capabilities within Windows, we have a couple more options. So let me clear my screen here. So what we're doing to test this out is I'm going to come in, I've got an FTP server, it's set up on a Windows domain controller, but what we're going to do is we're going to kick up two FTP services. So we're going to kick up one that is using IIS, and this was actually done on port 2021. So again, we use port 21, but in this case, we're just going to say 2021 to differentiate it from our FileZilla service that is using port 21, all right? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create policies that are bound to either FileZilla or IIS. So in one case, it's going to be process-based segmentation based on like an exe file. And for the other one, it's going to be based on a service, the FTP SVC, that's actually running on the domain controller itself. Now, how can we kind of gauge that this is working? Well, because IIS is open, essentially, we're also going to have a web server that is running actively on port 80. So what we want to do in the end is permit two flows, right? We want to allow flows to come dynamically to passive FTP services being served by IIS. And we want, again, another group of policy that's allowing dynamic port ranges coming into FileZilla, but this time from the process-based segmentation story, which is to the FileZilla server.exe. And then we want anything coming in beyond that, like for instance, we can test to this web server, to ultimately be denied because we're not allowing any other traffic through. So again, this more or less just going to prove that our other policies towards the exe file, towards the service, are actually up and running and working as intended. So let me close this out. We'll take a look. We'll kind of level set with our test bed here. So if I come over, this is going to be our Yeah, this is the domain controller. We can kind of see the DC01 up here. So if I connect to FileZilla, let's take a little look at what's being done here. Is I've got a user set up, just called Jason, right? Aptly named. And then he is actually using a path on the desktop that's going to this FileZilla data folder, which only has one file in it. And then I also have IIS. Let's open up our server manager. Actually, I should have just opened up IIS manager, but we'll open this up and we'll take a look at our IIS policy. And we have a FTP site stood up within here. And if we take a look at this, let's go to, we can see it is serving up, it's actually in the C drive this time, but it's serving up an Azure AD Connect link. And then if we take a look at, I believe it's in the authentication, we're just using basic authentication. So it's going to be ingrained Active Directory users, which I have an FTP user set up for. So this is our IIS settings. Again, basic settings for this guy. It's just going to be setting up, reading from this directory. And again, it's serving on port 2021. The client, as you can see, is just going to be a basic client. We should, right now, I've got both of them set up in here. If I connect to FileZilla, we should be able to see that FileZilla server is being served from that directory. If I connect to IIS, open it in a new tab, we can see that that Azure AD Connect link is being served up from that directory. So what I want to do now is go back and let's just kind of explore the policy. I have the Cisco Secure Workload agent is up and running on this server. We can actually kick up our services. We should be able to see, should have just resorted it. The Cisco Secure Workload Enforcement and Deep Visibility Agent are both running in here. It's the same agent, just different services running from that agent installation. So what I've done is I've just structured this to where that particular server is being put into this, this application group. So we have the workload in here, JSON DC01. But right now, we don't have any policies defined except for our catch-all, which is inherent with any Cisco Secure Workload kind of application workspace installation. So we need to define a couple policies. So what we want to do is, again, we're using passive FTP on both of those. I'll show you again when we go back to that client that it's using passive FTP. So how can we define very easily a policy for both of those processes that are running that allow, again, dynamic ports to come in to those? So what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and add a manual policy here. The first one's just going to be allow. Come in. I'm just going to allow everybody within this organization, which is my name in this case, to come to anything in this scope, which is the FTP, which encompasses this workload. I'm going to allow TCP because, again, FTP uses TCP, and I'm going to just say create. And what it's going to do is you're going to see TCP on any port and protocol. So right now, everything would be wide open if I were to go enforce this, and everything would be allowed. But what we want to do is restrict that to only a subset of services or exe files that are running on that server to allow those random TCP sessions to actually come in. So what I'm going to do is click on that, and as you can see, well, my big head's in the way, this TCP any over here, if I click on that, it's going to bring up basically a kind of a summary, right? But if we look down here at the show advanced options, what we can do is start to define some other kind of variables, right, around what we want this filter to encompass. We can see a lot of stuff around the consumer, which would be the source in our case. But what we want to do is actually reference stuff on the provider end, the server end, and in this case, the FTP server end. We can do users or groups, binary path, or services. So what I want to do first is let's actually take a look at the IIS service. So we need to actually provide what they call the short name for that service. So if I go back to the server, there's a couple different ways we can do that. If we look in here, typically it's not going to be real easy to come in and define. What I like to do to find the short name is go into like a PowerShell prompt, and we could just say, let me clear this out, get hyphen, whoops, and it did ACL, start typing in service, and it's going to give us all the services that are actually running, or in this case, not running, that are installed on this machine. And what we can do is we can look for that FTP service to see what the short name is, or the display name. So if we look up right in here, we can see the Microsoft FTP service is actually named FTP SVC. We also see the FileZilla server that's actually running on here, and I'm going to give you a little caveat around that here in just a bit. But for right now, we want to allow traffic coming into this service on any TCP port to be allowed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, and under provider service, I'm going to type in that short name, FTP SVC. And click update. And there we go. Now notice it still says TCP/any, but if I look over here, we can see a little flag, and this policy actually has some process level controls. Now we want to come in, and we also want to add another policy, but for FileZilla. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to increment this, because otherwise I'd kind of want to group them together. So I'm going to say priority 101. Again, it's going to be an allow. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to say anything coming in on JLund, coming into that FTP scope object, we want to allow in on TCP/any. So we'll do that. We can see it sends it below, right? Had we kept the same priority number, it would have tried to group these together. It would have been a little funky, and it wouldn't have worked as intended. So what we're going to do now is same process. I'm going to click on this. We're going to come over and click on the ports and protocols, the show advanced options. And you can type in a nice description here. We could say, FileZilla, TCP/any. But now we want to look at, hey, are we going to allow the service, or do we need to allow something else? And this is kind of a caveat that I ran across, and I found a way that I really like. I did come in and I experimented with allowing to this service, but the service is actually kind of just running port 8080, which is the controller for FileZilla. So what I found was a really good way to come in and look at this is by coming in and going to Resource Monitor. So if we look at Resource Monitor and we go down to the Network tab and over to Listening Ports, what I found is that we can take a look. Come on. There we go. Again, I'll just usually sort by port, whatever I'm looking for. But we can see that port 21 is not opened by that FileZilla server service per se, but it's opened by this FileZilla server.exe. So that's really what we're going to work with when we install this new process level control. If you look at the port 2021, which was the Microsoft service, notice it's being served up by service host, and then FTP SVC was the short name we used for that process level control for the service itself. So what we want to do is find where this FileZilla lives. So if we go to the C drive, program files, FileZilla server, we can see that FileZilla server.exe is living right in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that path. I'm going to come over here, and instead of doing a service, what we're going to do is this binary path. I'm going to paste that in. We'll add that exe file, FileZilla server.exe, and we'll click update. So again, now we can see, along with our description, FileZilla, TCP/any, we have a process level control on this rule. So again, up until this point, what we want is for anything coming into these two to be allowed. Everything else should be denied, including our web traffic. And that reminds me, let's go back and take a look at that web traffic, make sure that we are serving that web port up as we think we are. Let's open up Chrome. Over here, I've got it bookmarked. Okay, so we do see IIS is up and running, which is good, right? We'll go back over here. Let's go to enforce. We'll enforce these policies, kind of latest policies. It gives us a recap. I know my big dome is in the way. Let's go through here, back. Sorry, lost my mouse. Click next, next, scroll down, accept and enforce. So now we kind of just sit and wait, right? It's going to go out. It's hopefully going to enforce this. What I've found is that we're doing process level controls with Windows filtering platform is it's going to parse these rules. If we get anything wrong, like the service name, or if we get the exe file path incorrect, it's still going to process all those rules for us. But what we'll find is that it will just skip the ones that it really wasn't able to understand. And that reminds me, I totally forgot to allow 3389. So this is going to die if I don't really quickly add a policy around that. Just go ahead. Actually, let's just add it to this existing one. So what I'll say is for this guy, we'll add TCP. Yep, head out of the way, 3389. Oh, let's just add a different one. Let's say add policy, JLund, FTP. We'll give it its own rule then. Create. There we go. Go ahead. I bet it died. Yep, it died. Let's go ahead and enforce this new one. At least we know it works, right? Accept and enforce. Okay. So now if we watch through enforcement status, we should see this come through. And we do actually see, let me move my head, a policy count of 6. So I'd expect that we see 7 once this one actually completes. So we'll just watch it for a second. What I found with these process level controls is if you did mess something up and it wasn't able to kind of parse the service name or wasn't able to see that exe on that particular workload, is this would say partial success. So it's saying config success to me means that it probably did take both of those policies that we just set. Go back here, we still see 6. It does take, a minute, at least for it to be represented in here. One tried and true way is when this comes back, we're probably back in business. But I do like to see this. It gives me the warm and fuzzy that it's actually all working correctly. Enforcement, status. Let's see if it works. There we go. Cool. So now this will have changed to 7, I would think. Sometimes the UI takes a second to update. Oh, it's actually 8. So it did ingress, egress. Cool. So we can come back here. Another fun fact that I found through this is you can look at the rules. We can come into, again, PowerShell. If I were to clear this out, I'm in the C program files tetration directory. And if you notice this tet-enforce.exe is in here, you can do a tet-enforce.exe-l-f, and I like to look at the verbose ones. And what it's going to do is it's going to print out those WFP rules for you. And one kind of check that I was running through as I was doing this is just looking for, there should be a couple rules in here, if it worked, to this domain controller on TCP, which is protocol 6. And then we should be able to see, we do see here the process level control to the FileZilla server. And then I would think we'd see another one if it went into the FTP SVC, which we do right here, right? I found that if those weren't in there, one place to go check to see the possible, like, why didn't this happen, is you can go back to, and again, I am totally in the way here. Go back to here. We'll take a look in the C drive, and you go into the tetration folder, look in the logs and go to the tetenforce.exe. And typically if you scroll all the way to the bottom, if something failed, it's going to spell it out pretty quickly within here. You're going to see something like FTP SBC service not found or executable not found in the other case, but you're going to see why it wasn't applied and why it was eventually skipped in this tetenforce.exe log. Now, testing, right? We need to test this out. We need to see if it actually worked. So I'm going to go back over to my client, and if I try to refresh this, this should fail. So we'll give it a second. Which it's just spinning. So again, the default deny is working in this case. I guess, so again, I do this to prove that allowing things in, TCP any would typically encompass 80, but because we're doing it to a particular process, right? Port 80 is not reachable anymore because the FTP service or the FileZilla, .exe is not allowed, which also makes me think we do have port 8080 open to FileZilla for the control. I don't know if it's reachable through the outside, but let's test that. No. And that's because it's going to the FTP, or sorry, the FileZilla server service rather than the executable file. So let's go here. Let's close both of these out. And let's retry. Let's actually make sure this kills. Okay, so it's not connected to any server. So the first one we'll try is the FileZilla server. And we can see, it did list everything out. If I were to try to, download this, we could see the file transfer was successful. Do that one more time, but with detailed logging on, so we could see the passiveness of this. So click on it again, we'll overwrite it. We can see it's entering passive mode. It basically just re-downloads it, but we can see, it was successful. So let's go to the other one. Let's try IIS on port 2021. Open that up. We see, it was also successful. So we're still showing detailed logs. Let's go ahead and download this. Okay, and we can see again, it was entering passive mode and that the data transition was complete. So again, we can see that both of these are running all while we are still denying, any other TCP port to this particular server. Had enough time elapsed, we should be able to go in and see, that in fact, in the enforcement tab, we are able to see these different permits and denies happening in real time. I don't have the data in here quite yet. But again, this is a pretty simplistic example of how we can come through and allow certain ports and protocols to groups of specific services, to groups of specific binaries. We can even restrict that further by saying not only are we saying TCP any to this particular service or process, but we can do it from maybe a specific user, right? Or a user group within our local accounts or even within Active Directory. So there's a lot of flexibility around these Windows-based controls within the system that we can use to achieve goals like we saw within this demo. Thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out at any time, jlund@cisco.com. Thank you.